The world knew Marilyn Monroe as the goddess in white, the woman who made presidents stammer and nations dream. But on August 3rd, 1962, just 48 hours before her body would be found lifeless in her Brentwood bedroom, she was neither a goddess nor a dream. She was terrified. Her hands trembled as she dialed a number she had memorized years ago, a number that belonged to the only man in Hollywood who truly understood what it meant to be devoured by fame. Marlon Brando was 3,000 miles away in New York when his phone rang that Friday afternoon, and what Marilyn told him in those final moments would haunt him for 32 years, until he finally broke his silence in 1994. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but those minutes contained a secret so dangerous that Brando would later say, "If I had known what I know now, I would have gotten on the next plane to Los Angeles. Maybe she would still be alive." What did Marilyn Monroe say to Marlon Brando 2 days before her death? The answer changes everything we thought we knew about that tragic August weekend. If you're fascinated by the untold stories behind Hollywood's most iconic figures, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We dive deep into the mysteries that shaped entertainment history, bringing you the facts behind the legends. To understand that final phone call, we must travel back 7 years, to December 1955, when Marilyn Monroe and Marlon Brando first truly connected at the premiere of The Rose Tattoo in New York City. The premiere was a spectacle of old Hollywood glamour, with limousines stretching down the block and flashbulbs exploding like small stars in the winter night. Both Monroe and Brando had been assigned the somewhat humiliating task of serving as celebrity ushers, a publicity stunt designed to pack the theater with fans hoping for a glimpse of genuine stardom. But for Marilyn and Marlon, something unexpected happened that night. As they stood together in the crimson-carpeted lobby, directing patrons to their seats and posing for photographs, they recognized something in each other that few others could see. Behind Marilyn's platinum curls and breathless voice, Brando detected the calculating intelligence and deep insecurity that mirrored his own. Behind Brando's brooding intensity and method actor mystique, Marilyn saw a man just as trapped by his image as she was by hers. The backstage gossip that night was electric. Crew members watched as Monroe and Brando disappeared into a dressing room during intermission, emerging 20 minutes later with conspiratorial smiles. But what actually happened in that room was far more intimate than any physical encounter. They talked, really talked, in a way that neither of them could with almost anyone else. Marilyn confessed her frustration with being typecast as the dumb blonde, her desperate desire to be taken seriously as an actress. Brando shared his contempt for the Hollywood machine, his feeling that every role was slowly eroding his soul. They discovered they were both students at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg, both trying to use method acting to access something real beneath the manufactured personas. By the end of that December night, they had exchanged phone numbers, and what would become a 7-year relationship had begun. It was not primarily a romance, though romance was certainly part of it. It was something deeper and more complicated, a meeting of two damaged artists who understood that fame was not a blessing but a beautiful curse. What followed over the next 7 years was one of Hollywood's most carefully guarded secrets. Marilyn Monroe and Marlon Brando conducted what can only be described as an invisible affair, a relationship that existed almost entirely outside the gaze of the press and public. In an era when paparazzi stalked every restaurant and nightclub, when gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons could make or break careers with a single item, the absence of any photographs or concrete evidence of Monroe and Brando together is extraordinary. They met only in places where cameras could not follow. Brando's sparsely furnished apartment in New York, Marilyn's increasingly isolated home in Brentwood, and occasionally in the private studios of the Actors Studio, where Lee Strasberg enforced a strict no-press policy. They communicated primarily by telephone, often calling each other late at night when the rest of the world was asleep and they could drop their public masks. Brando would later describe these years in his 1994 autobiography with a mixture of tenderness and guilt. He wrote that the relationship was intermittent, that there were long stretches when they did not see or speak to each other, followed by intense periods of reconnection. The physical aspect seems to have been brief, occurring primarily in 1955 and early 1956, but the emotional and intellectual connection persisted until Marilyn's death. What kept them apart was the recognition that they were both too damaged, too self-destructive to sustain anything resembling a normal partnership. Brando watched from a distance as she cycled through marriages with Joe DiMaggio and Arthur Miller, as her dependence on barbiturates deepened, as her reputation for being difficult on set grew from whispers to headlines. He offered what he could, which was understanding and occasional refuge, but he knew it was not enough. One particularly revealing anecdote from this period concerns a party in Los Angeles around 1957. Brando arrived late to find the house packed with Hollywood elite, everyone performing their public selves. He wandered through the rooms and eventually found himself in a small study where a piano sat against the wall. And there, hunched over the keys and playing a melancholy jazz melody, was Marilyn Monroe. She was so absorbed in the music that she had not noticed anyone else had entered. Brando stood in the doorway and watched her for several minutes, struck by the profound loneliness radiating from this woman who could not walk down a street without causing a riot. When she finally looked up and saw him, the Marilyn Monroe persona snapped into place like a mask clicking shut. But for just a moment before that transformation, Brando had seen Norma Jean, the scared girl from foster homes who had never quite believed she deserved any of the extraordinary things that had happened to her. That glimpse haunted him more than any of the intimate moments they shared. The glue that held Monroe and Brando together throughout these years was their shared devotion to Lee Strasberg and the actor's studio. For both of them, the studio represented something more than just a place to hone their craft. It was a sanctuary, a space where they could strip away the Hollywood artifice and attempt to access something genuine. Strasberg's method acting techniques demanded that actors draw on their own emotional memories and psychological wounds to create authentic performances. For Brando, who had grown up in an abusive household with an alcoholic father, this process was both therapeutic and destructive. For Marilyn Monroe, who had spent her childhood shuffling between foster homes and had been sexually abused as a young girl, the method was even more dangerous. Strasberg pushed her to excavate her deepest pain and bring it to the surface, and while this occasionally resulted in moments of genuine brilliance on screen, it also left her emotionally raw and vulnerable. In 1961, this alliance took on a more concrete form when Monroe and Brando began discussing the possibility of forming their own production company. The idea was radical. Two of Hollywood's biggest stars would break free from the studio system entirely, choosing their own projects and maintaining creative control. Documents from estate sales have since revealed the seriousness of these plans, including draft partnership agreements and lists of potential properties to adapt. But the production company never materialized. The logistics proved too complex, and Monroe's personal life was spiraling into chaos. By late 1961, she was battling severe depression and addiction. Her attendance on the set of Something's Got to Give was erratic, and the studio was threatening to sue her. The dream of artistic independence died slowly, strangled by the same Hollywood machinery it was meant to escape. If 1955 was the year Marilyn Monroe and Marlon Brando found each other, 1961 was the year they nearly lost everything. For Marilyn, it was a descent into a darkness so profound that those close to her genuinely feared for her life. Her marriage to Arthur Miller had collapsed under the weight of mutual disappointment. Her dependence on prescription drugs had reached terrifying levels. She was taking Nembutal to sleep, Benzedrine to wake up, and various combinations of barbiturates throughout the day to manage her anxiety. Her behavior on movie sets had become so erratic that directors and producers were beginning to consider her uninsurable, which in Hollywood terms meant unemployable. And then, in February 1961, the situation became critical. After what her psychiatrist described as a nervous breakdown, Marilyn was admitted to the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic in New York, supposedly for rest and evaluation. What happened during her time there would traumatize her for the rest of her short life. She was placed in a locked ward typically reserved for severely disturbed patients, her clothing was taken away, and she was observed through a small window in the door like a specimen in a laboratory. She felt she had been tricked and imprisoned, and the fear that consumed her during those days was primal and overwhelming. She managed to smuggle out a desperate note to her former husband, Joe DiMaggio, who stormed the clinic and demanded her immediate release. After 3 days of psychological torture, she was transferred to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. It was during her stay at Columbia Presbyterian that Marilyn received a telegram that would become one of the most poignant artifacts of her relationship with Marlon Brando. The telegram, which would later be sold at auction, read simply, "Don't be afraid of being afraid. This is an opportunity for re-evaluation, not an end. You are stronger than you know. Marlon." The message arrived when Marilyn was at her lowest point. She kept that telegram with her for the rest of her life, carrying it in her purse as a talisman against the abyss. Friends who saw it noticed how worn it became, the paper thin from repeated folding and unfolding, the words nearly illegible from the oils of her fingertips. It was a lifeline, and she clung to it desperately. By the time 1962 arrived, Marilyn Monroe was holding on by her fingernails. She had been fired from Something's Got to Give after repeated absences and erratic behavior on set. The public humiliation was immense. 20th Century Fox issued statements painting her as unreliable and unprofessional. The press, which had once fawned over her, now ran cruel articles about her declining beauty and mental state. She was 36 years old, and in the brutal calculus of Hollywood, that made her old. Her romantic life was a shambles, a series of affairs with men who either used her for her fame or tried to control her. The rumored relationships with President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy would later become the stuff of conspiracy theories, but in early 1962, they were simply two more sources of confusion and pain. She was drinking heavily to supplement the pills, creating a dangerous chemical cocktail that left her foggy and disoriented for much of the day. Brando, watching this from New York, felt helpless. He called Marilyn occasionally, but the conversations had become difficult. She would sometimes be so medicated that she slurred her words and lost her train of thought mid-sentence. Other times, she would be manic and paranoid, convinced that the FBI was tapping her phones or that studio executives were plotting to destroy her. Brando did not dismiss these fears entirely because he knew that some of them might be justified. The FBI did maintain a file on Monroe due to her past marriage to Arthur Miller, who had been investigated for communist sympathies. In July 1962, just weeks before her death, Marilyn made another attempt to reach out to Brando. She sent him a handwritten note, later discovered among her effects. "Time is very critical. I need to get Lee here permanently, not just as a visitor. Please call me urgently." Lee referred to Lee Strasberg, and the urgency in Marilyn's handwriting was palpable. The letters pressed hard into the paper as if force could convey what words could not. Strasberg did not come to Los Angeles permanently, and whatever Marilyn was facing, she faced it without the support she desperately sought. And so we arrive at Friday, August 3rd, 1962. In New York, Marlon Brando was going about his day when his phone rang sometime in the afternoon. In Los Angeles, it would have been late morning, and Marilyn Monroe was alone in her Brentwood home on Fifth Helena Drive. The house was supposed to be her sanctuary, a modest hacienda-style property that represented independence and a fresh start. But increasingly, it felt like a prison. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, was there somewhere in the house. Her publicist, Patricia Newcomb, had stayed over the night before. But Marilyn was alone in her bedroom when she picked up the white telephone on her nightstand and dialed Brando's number in New York. When the phone rang in Brando's apartment, he picked it up and heard Marilyn's voice on the other end of the line. Immediately, he knew something was wrong. This was not the Marilyn Monroe voice, the sultry purr that she used for public consumption. This was Norma Jean, and she was frightened. Brando would later struggle to describe the call in his autobiography, choosing his words carefully, clearly holding something back even as he purported to tell the truth. He wrote that she sounded different, that there was an urgency and fear in her tone that he had not heard before. She told him things that made him believe her life was in danger, not from herself but from others. She spoke of people around her, of pressures being applied, of feeling trapped in a situation she could not escape. The conversation was brief, less than 10 minutes according to Brando's recollection, and it ended with Marilyn saying she had to go, that she would call him back soon. She never called back. 48 hours later, in the early morning of August 5, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her bedroom, a telephone clutched in her hand. The official cause of death was listed as probable suicide due to acute barbiturate poisoning. She had consumed enough Nembutal and chloral hydrate to kill several people. The investigation was brief, the conclusions tidy, and the case was closed. But Brando never believed it. In the days following Marilyn's death, he replayed that phone call obsessively in his mind, analyzing every word, every tone, every background noise. He became convinced that what happened to Marilyn was not suicide. He believed she had been murdered, or at the very least, had been driven to her death by forces she could not control. And he carried that belief, along with a crushing burden of guilt, for 3 decades. Why did Marlon Brando wait until 1994 to reveal the existence of that final phone call? The answer speaks to the complex psychology of guilt and self-preservation. In the immediate aftermath of Marilyn's death, Brando was questioned by investigators. He confirmed that he had known her, that they had been friends, but he said nothing about the phone call on August 3rd. He was not legally obligated to reveal it, and he made a calculated decision to remain silent. Partly it was self-protection. Brando was at a crucial point in his career, and being drawn into the media circus surrounding Marilyn's death could have been devastating. Partly it was a sense that revealing the call would serve no purpose. Marilyn was dead, and no testimony from him would bring her back. But the real reason for Brando's silence was guilt. He felt that he had failed Marilyn Monroe in her final moments. She had reached out to him, had trusted him with her fear, and he had not saved her. He had not gotten on a plane to Los Angeles. He had not called Dr. Greenson or her publicist or anyone who might have intervened. He had simply waited for her to call back, and by the time he realized she would not, it was too late. That guilt ate at him for decades, manifesting in self-destructive behavior, failed relationships, and a growing contempt for the Hollywood system that he believed had destroyed Marilyn. Friends and colleagues noticed that he could not bear to watch her films or see her photographs. If her name came up in conversation, he would change the subject or leave the room. By the early 1990s, Brando had decided to write his autobiography, partly as a way to exorcise his demons. The book Songs My Mother Taught Me, published in 1994, was brutally honest about many aspects of his life, and finally, 32 years after the fact, he wrote about Marilyn Monroe. The section was relatively brief, just a few pages in a long book, but it was explosive. Brando confirmed that he and Marilyn had been involved romantically in the 1950s and had remained close friends until her death. He described the phone call on August 3, 1962, though in carefully vague terms, and he stated clearly that he did not believe her death was suicide. "I have always thought she was murdered," he wrote, a statement that reignited conspiracy theories and prompted a new wave of investigations. The question that haunted Brando and now haunts us is simple and unanswerable. What exactly did Marilyn Monroe say during that phone call on August 3rd? Brando's autobiography is frustratingly vague on this point. He tells us she sounded frightened, that she felt her life was in danger from others, that she spoke of pressures and being trapped. But he does not provide specific quotes or detailed accounts. This vagueness could be interpreted in several ways. Perhaps Brando genuinely could not remember the specifics after so many years. Perhaps he was protecting someone, worried that revealing too much would expose powerful people to accusations. Or perhaps the truth was simply too painful or too complicated to put into words. Researchers and Monroe biographers have spent decades trying to piece together what that conversation might have contained. We know that in early August 1962, Marilyn was deeply enmeshed in complicated relationships with both John and Robert Kennedy. She had reportedly become a liability to the Kennedy administration, knowing too much and being too unstable to trust with secrets. There are suggestions that she was being pressured to remain silent about these affairs and that she was growing increasingly resentful of being treated as disposable. We also know that she was terrified of being committed to a psychiatric institution again. Dr. Greenson, her psychiatrist, had enormous power over her life, and there were whispers that this power was being abused. Could these have been the dangers Marilyn spoke of to Brando? The pressure from the Kennedys, the threat of institutionalization, the feeling of being controlled by people who claim to have her best interests at heart. Another possibility relates to the circumstances of Marilyn's actual death. The official narrative is that she took her own life by swallowing dozens of pills, but there are aspects of the case that have never made sense to investigators. There were no pill residues in her stomach, which should have been present if she had taken such a massive oral dose. There were no water glasses in the bedroom. The timeline of her death contains gaps and contradictions that suggest someone might have altered the scene or delayed calling for help. Could Marilyn have told Brando something about these circumstances, something that suggested she knew she was in danger? Brando never explicitly said so, but his insistence that she was murdered, combined with his refusal to provide details, has fueled speculation that he knew more than he was willing to share. Adding another layer of intrigue is the existence of the FBI file on Marilyn Monroe, a file that was partially declassified in the decades following her death, but still contains numerous redacted sections. The FBI's interest in Monroe stemmed primarily from her marriage to Arthur Miller, who had been investigated for potential communist sympathies during the McCarthy era. But the file also contains references to her relationships with the Kennedy brothers and to concerns about her potential as a security risk. Most intriguingly, the file includes entries dated August 1962, right around the time of Marilyn's death, though much of the content remains blacked out. What do those redacted passages say? Conspiracy theorists believe they contain evidence of government surveillance of Monroe in her final days, possibly even surveillance of her phone calls. This is not as far-fetched as it might sound. We know from later revelations that the FBI and other intelligence agencies routinely wiretapped people deemed to be of interest. We know that the Kennedy brothers, particularly Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, had the power to order such surveillance, and we know that there was deep concern in Washington about what Marilyn might reveal if she ever decided to go public with her knowledge of her affairs with the Kennedys. The fact that Brando mentioned hearing background noises during the call, noises that suggested to him that Marilyn might not have been alone or that the line might not have been secure, takes on ominous significance. Was she trying to tell him something while knowing that others were listening? When Brando's autobiography was published in 1994, the revelation about the phone call with Marilyn created an immediate sensation. News outlets around the world ran stories about Brando's claim that Monroe had been murdered. Documentaries were produced re-examining the evidence. The district attorney's office in Los Angeles was pressured to reopen the investigation. They conducted a brief review and ultimately concluded that while there were unanswered questions about the circumstances of Monroe's death, there was insufficient evidence to overturn the original finding. The case remained officially closed, but Brando's revelation had accomplished something important. It had given voice to the doubts that many people had quietly harbored for years, the sense that the official story did not quite add up. It had validated the instinct that something more sinister than simple suicide had occurred, and it had added a powerful new element to the Monroe mythology, the image of her making desperate phone calls in her final days, trying to reach people who might save her, only to be let down. Brando's account painted Marilyn not as a tragic but passive victim, but as someone actively fighting for survival, aware of the dangers surrounding her, and trying to find a way out. In the years after the book's publication, Brando rarely spoke publicly about Monroe again. He had said what he needed to say, had lifted the burden of silence, and now he wanted to move on. But those who knew him said the guilt never fully left him. He would sometimes mention, usually late at night, and usually when he had been drinking, that he should have done more, that he could have saved her if he had just acted. His friends would try to console him, to point out that he could not have known what would happen. But Brando could not forgive himself. The phone call haunted him until his own death in 2004. More than 6 decades after Marilyn Monroe's death and 2 decades after Marlon Brando's revelation, we are left with questions that may never be answered. What exactly did Marilyn tell Brando on August 3, 1962? What specific threats or pressures was she facing? Was her death truly suicide, or was it something more sinister? And if it was murder, who was responsible? The passage of time has made these questions even harder to answer. Most of the key witnesses are now dead. Documents have been lost or destroyed. The FBI file remains partially redacted. The Kennedy family has no interest in revisiting these allegations. What we are left with is the story itself, a story of two damaged artists who found each other in the brutal machinery of Hollywood and tried to offer each other understanding and support in a world that valued them only for what they could produce. We are left with the image of Marilyn Monroe, frightened and alone, making phone calls in her final days, trying to reach someone who could help her. We are left with the image of Marlon Brando, receiving that call and failing to act, then living with the consequences for the rest of his life. And we are left with the larger tragedy that both of these images represent, the way that fame, rather than liberating these talented people, trapped them in roles they could not escape and ultimately consumed them. The phone call between Marilyn Monroe and Marlon Brando on August 3, 1962, lasted less than 10 minutes, but its impact has reverberated through decades. It has shaped our understanding of Monroe's final days, adding a dimension of active fear and struggle to what had been understood as passive despair. It has influenced countless books, documentaries, and films about Monroe. It has contributed to the ongoing debate about whether her death was suicide or something more sinister. And perhaps most significantly, it has served as a powerful reminder of the human cost of fame, of the way that celebrity isolates and endangers those who achieve it. The final tragedy of Marilyn Monroe's life is not just that she died young, but that she died afraid and alone, reaching out for help that never came. The final tragedy of Marlon Brando's relationship with Monroe is not just that he lost a friend, but that he spent decades tormented by the belief that he could have saved her. These tragedies remind us that fame is not a shield against suffering, but often a magnifier of it, that success in Hollywood does not guarantee happiness or even survival, and that the people we admire on screen are far more vulnerable than their images suggest. Marilyn Monroe's voice fell silent on August 5, 1962, but the echo of that final phone call persists, a haunting reminder of what was lost and what might have been saved. Marlon Brando's confession in 1994 gave that echo new life, ensuring that future generations would know that Marilyn did not simply give up, that she fought until the end. That small act of remembrance and honesty, delayed though it was, may be the truest tribute Brando could offer to his friend, a final acknowledgement of her struggle and his failure, of their shared humanity in the face of inhuman circumstances.